in finance and have taken steps to ensure that corporations don't lose sight of the importance of sustainability through educating and guiding them through the process. The first influential leader we have on the panel is Ms. Martina Mcpherson, who has a long-term track record in sustainable investing. She has been internationally recognized as a strategic influencer for her EDF strategy, product and research work in both industry and academia. Currently, she's the head of ESG strategy at Odo BHF AMNPE and president of the Network for Sustainable Financial Markets. In 2014, she founded SI Partners Limited, an ESG investment content, research, and analytics firm. Prior to that, she also held a range of senior global research, risk management, business, and product development roles at Moody's ESG Solutions and more. Early in her career, she worked for FNC Asset Management and Deutsche Bank. She is also a visiting fellow at Henley Business School and a guest lecturer at University of Zurich. She is an advisory board member at ROSIF and the Sustainable Investment Forum for East Europe and at the European Law Institute. She was also a mentor at the Global Thinkers Forum and at the ICRS. In addition to her extensive work experience, she is also an award-winning multilingual writer, lecturer, and presenter on sustainable investment, risk management, and green finance themes, and contributes regularly to the industry and academic publications. Today, she'll be helping answer questions on sustainable investing and share her depth and breadth of knowledge on the topic. The second leader we have with us today is Ms. Jessica Robinson. She's a global expert on sustainable finance and responsible investing, advising institutional investors, think tanks, governments, regulators, and companies on a broad range of issues relating to green finance, sustainable and ESG investment, as well as climate, carbon, and gender finance. With an extensive background in professional services and business consulting, she has worked in the financial services and sustainability industry for more than 20 years. She has lived and worked in the UAE, Asia, Europe, and North America, and across a range of different markets and regulatory environments. She frequently contributes to articles, author reports, and speaks at conferences on issues relating to sustainable finance and responsible investment. Recently, she has plotted the green finance ecosystem across Asia to inform the strategy of a major U.S. foundation, support a market regulator in developing its sustainable finance initiatives, and worked as a technical advisor for a government-funded research project on sustainable investment trends. She also runs Moxie Future, the world's first insights community and blog platform focused on empowering women as sustainable, responsible, and impact investors to grow their wealth while investing in a better world according to their values. The company aims to support women on their sustainable investment journey. Today, she'll provide some insights on sustainable investing and also share more of her experience over the years. The third leader we have on the panel is Dr. Nisha Coley, who is an impact leader in sustainability, startups, and entrepreneurship with over 20 years of experience in consulting, training, managing finance functions in multinational and private organizations. She defines success as the ability of a company to transition from lacking sustainability and governance to reporting ethically and transparently. Moreover, she finds success in mentoring and advising startups to grow and formulate a solid web of connections. Prior to settling in Singapore to establish Nishvin Consulting, she had the privilege of traveling across the world and living in different countries where she was fortunate to advise senior executives, directors, and corporates through Nishvin Consulting. The motto of her life and her company is Elevate Your Potential. Nishvin has spread its wings with channel partners across many countries. To further her creativity and imagination, she loves exploring and researching various business topics. She was awarded the Corporate Governance Research Scholar Award in 2008 from the International Corporate Governance Network for her outstanding research in the field of corporate governance. Since 2008, she has published a number of corporate governance case studies and research articles in internationally renowned journals such as the International Journal of Disclosure and Governance, HBSB, Richard Ivey, Cambridge, and more. To create a larger impact, she has created a sustainability platform which is AI-enabled called CorpStage. Today, we will hear more about the capabilities of CorpStage as well. She will join Ms. Mcpherson and Ms. Robinson to speak about investment analysis, more about ESGs, and sustainability within finance. Please join me in welcoming all three of our panelists, Ms. Jessica Robinson, Ms. Martina Mcpherson, and Dr. Nisha Coley. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suhana. Thank you. Let me start with the topic of today, which is ESG data and implementation challenges. We all know that ESG investments are on the rise, and the flows have surpassed in the first quarter of 2021 by USD 20 billion. Institutional investors have launched carbon transition and ESG funds. To sum up, virtually all asset managers are now incorporating ESG information in their investment process. So I would like to hear from you, what are the motives of ESG, investors to invest in sustainable funds? Let's do a poll for that. And I'm curious to see the answers. Okay, let's see what people have to say. Which is the most important reason for the growth in sustainable investing? Yes. Okay, so we got the maximum. Oh, still going on. Yeah, so we got the maximum answer for desire to align investments with corporate values. Let's hear from the speakers today whether this is true, whether the investors, they actually look at corporate values, right? On the other hand, from the corporate side, we have seen how pandemic has highlighted the importance of sustainability even more. And sustainability is not only about global warming and climate change, but also about social issues such as economic inequality, poverty, healthcare crisis, etc. Companies are still seen grappling with issues related to worker safety and employees' job security. Amidst all these issues, if the corporates continue to focus on the returns and profits, to say it better, if they continue to adopt short term and non sustainable approaches, how will things change? For the companies to focus on sustainability, a large part of motivation comes from the financial investors who are willing to invest in ESG and sustainability focused assets and reward sustainability linked performance. But the big question in front of investors is how to identify sustainable companies. They need data. I have a question for you all. One more short poll that I have, that which is the best source for ESG data related to the companies? So, what do you think is the best source of ESG data? Today, we'll hear from Martina and Jessica what they consider for doing their investments. Is it annual sustainability reports, rating and ranking, websites of the companies, or independent analyst reports? Okay, so people think that it's independent analyst reports that, enables the data sourcing. Martina, you have to help us to understand that. So let's hear from Martina, who is the global head of ESG strategy at Otto BHF Asset Management, more on data sources. So Martina, please elaborate on which data sources you use and how do you evaluate reliability of data? Are there any frameworks or standards do asset managers use? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Nisha and Sohana. Great pleasure to be here and to answer very much these important questions when and where ESG investment, as well as frameworks and necessary dependencies when we look at reporting/disclosures are concerned. Maybe to start with your first question, I mean, it's very much a mixture of all these different type of ESG related data sources and more. So we use within Oddo BHF Asset Management, and this is quite a common approach, we use third-party ratings. We also overlay and triage these with our own ESG research and rating assessments, because we cover actually SME companies. And this is another side note. Many of the conventional data providers are still yet struggling to provide, obviously, coverage for SME companies / coverage even when and where certain jurisdictions in, for instance, emerging economies are concerned. But for us, it's an SME challenge across equities and fixed income. Hence, we undertake our own ratings and assessments. But then, of course, as part of that process, we go directly to websites of companies. We look at filings, we look at analyst reports, we look at integrated and/or sustainability reports. And I should say beyond this, of course, alternative data sources. And these data sources also screen social media, and other online related sources, publicly available information. And this is an increasingly important sphere, Nisha, because what we have seen is that there is divergence between the different type of ESG research and ratings methodologies. I might just revert back to an MIT Sloan study I'm very often quoting from 2019, who has assessed commonly used ESG research and rating providers and came to the conclusion that currently these ESG ratings for companies differ from one provider to the other. They are only correlated at around 60%, versus credit rating analyses, which again is, in the most part, these are solicited ratings, of course, as well. We should also highlight this, but they ultimately correlate amongst each other at the level of 99%. So clearly there is room for improvement when and where the different type of methodologies and further alignment is concerned. There are inherent biases when and where self-disclosed information is concerned. And ultimately, there is a challenge when and where real-time updates are concerned. Sometimes some of these ratings and even controversies assessments, and we have seen these, are out of date by the time ultimately the controversy itself had progressed, maybe no longer exists, and or had accelerated. So, undertaking your own ESG research and ratings overlay, triaging information, using different type of data sources is an absolute prerequisite.
Thank you so much, Martina. I truly understand. And, in fact, even I read a study from NYU Stern which stated the same issues, that the ratings and scoring organizations, there is inconsistency, incomparability, and some level of opaqueness as well as regards their formulas are concerned, the weightings and the ratings. Anyway, so Jessica, as the CEO of Moxie Future, you advise investors on responsible investments. I'm sure a lot of data analysis goes into evaluating investment opportunities and instruments. What role does ESG data play in your analysis when you're advising your clients on responsible investments? Over to you, Jessica.
So I think, there's two aspects to what I do. In a way, there's the work I do with institutional investors, regulators on the sustainable finance piece as well. And then sort of on the other side, the work with Moxie, which is around the retail investor level. So engaging with women in terms of sustainable investing within their own personal wealth. I think on the institutional level, and Martina and I have both been in this field for a long time, we've been working very, very hard to define what it means to be a responsible investor, and then what it means to leverage the ESG data that's available. I think we've obviously come a very long way, but we've still got a long way to go. And one thing that's happened in the last couple of years is these ESG frameworks have been very well developed at the institutional level. And I think, Martina, you can talk a lot better about what's happening in the European Union, but the work on the taxonomy, and also the technology that sits underneath that is really critical. One point I just wanted to make, because as someone who, I was in Asia for many, many years, and I'm now based in the Middle East, I think it's really just important to flag the regional differences that we have in terms of responsible investing and actually understanding what ESG data is and what's material. You know, in the Middle East, we're just beginning this process. The road is very much just beginning. So when you talk to institutional investors here, and actually, Nisha, you made the point, you know, sustainable investing is not just climate change, but at the same time, when you look at the critical issues and where we need the really, really good data, it is on things like water, climate change, air pollution, and so forth. And I think really from a sort of responsible investor perspective, there's the risk, you know, the risk aspect, the risk element, but then there's also the business opportunities. So looking at that low carbon transition and then actually being able to price those things into projects, assets, and so forth. Just on the retail level, again, you know, it's very much in its infancy. And one of the reasons behind Moxie Future and the book that I've just written on financial feminism is actually starting to engage with retail investors. Because, you know, the institutional level has been going on for a long time, but at the retail level, we're just very much beginning. And I think a lot of the focus has to be on education in that first instance, because you may have a lot of ESG data, but what do you do with it and how do you make different decisions in terms of your investments? And again, I think just flagging the regional differences there, I think Europe is far ahead, right? I think perhaps you probably agree, Martina.
Thank you, Jessica. And I also feel that that's a great initiative that you have taken for, you know, educating the retail investors. That's where we talk about ESG, you know, methodology, analysis, integration from the institutional investor side, and mostly towards like building of ETFs and portfolios, right? But we all know that yeah, it's a difficult task to do. It's not so easy, right? Okay. So we spoke about the emphasis on ratings and scorings, and we also, you know, discussed about the problems there. On the other hand, companies also face difficulties in identifying factors and metrics that promote their sustainability rankings, or, you know, they always wonder how they can improve their ESG scores so that they are able to receive more ESG funding. Now, this scenario typically gives rise to a problem very well discussed these days, and, you know, that's called greenwashing. We keep hearing about it everywhere, right? So, and it makes analysis by investors even more difficult than how to draw conclusions. Like Martina, you mentioned that you go to the websites of the companies, you look at the reports, and Jessica, you were talking about the frameworks development these days, like GRI, SASB, and we have TCFD and many more. But the problem is that how much can we trust that data, right? So because the issue is that every company wants to get more and more funding. If not funding, then they want their share prices to be high in the market. At least the perception of the company should be good in the market, right? So these are some of the issues that we are facing. I would like to take your views on that, Martina, that, you know, given this fact that data is not properly disclosed by the companies, does non-disclosure of what we call materiality causes skepticism about companies, and how do you tackle such issues?
Yeah, it's thank you, Nisha, and also very much supporting the references that we heard before. Ultimately, there are a layer of complexities, and there are multiple layers actually that lead to complexities when and where the corporate and, of course, the interconnected investment value chain are concerned. You know, when we look at data, when we look at disclosures, when we look at definitions, when we look at divergence, all the different topics we already brought up. And ultimately, companies maybe or issuers are still very much in the driver's seat, but also increasingly under scrutiny in regards to the different type of reporting requirements that they now must adhere to. Again, and Jessica mentioned that before, quite clearly, depending on jurisdiction, but there's generally, especially in Europe, if I may take that example again, now a drive that actually tries to build alongside the Sustainable Finance Action Plan, that builds a trajectory towards corporate disclosures, mandatory disclosures, when and where ESG information is concerned, and of course the equivalent on the investor side, SFDR. We all here in Europe, selling products in Europe, had to complete SFDR regulation, level 1 regulation, so to say, to disclose how we actually use ESG on our websites, in our pre-contractual information, in the different marketing documentation, and that happened by the 10th of March this year. We have now heard, that the initial timelines have been changed. We will by July 2022 now have to report in line with the so-called level 2 regulatory technical standards, highlighting sustainability risks and principal adverse impacts that we are creating through, potentially investment strategies. But there are ultimately, again, on the corporate side, a couple of areas for maybe even improvement here when and where these frameworks are concerned. You might know that for some time, the Non-Financial Reporting Directive for companies, the NFRD, has been in place. 2014-95 is the name of this EU directive. I think it was launched in 2017 for the first time for this annual reporting cycle. Now that NFRD was upgraded, updated, myself at Moody's, we participated in the NFRD consultations that happened, and the last one that happened in particular last year. Now we have seen just in April announcements that this disclosure directive will be again under review and will relaunch as the so-called Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is also important because when we talk about definitions and conundrums and the alphabet soup of ESG, right, it's very important to say, is this really non-financial? Is this not extra financial information? And maybe sustainability information hits the nail on the head because it is exactly as you both stated, more than just climate. But these sort of definitions aside, what is now happening is that thresholds are being ultimately raised. We can see that initially we had around 10,000 plus companies in Europe that had to adhere to, by market capitalization / number of employees most likely, that had to ultimately adhere to these guidelines. Now we're talking about more than 30,000 companies once ultimately the directive goes live. And now we're coming towards what I highlighted a bit earlier. We all as investors, and I've been quite vocal about this in the past, have seen that these sort of guidelines and principles should not only adhere to the larger companies, because especially the wider value chain, the corporate value chain, includes a lot of SME companies. Even investors such as ours now invest quite largely in SME companies. And how can we actually get a full picture on, not only scope emissions data, but also the broader sustainability risks associated with companies, associated with organizations, and maybe with the whole value chain at large, if we only get a fraction of this picture. So, but that means it has led to a lot of confusion. I recently spoke at a webinar by the European Commission and the Deutsche Aktieninstitut, which represents German enterprise and French enterprise. French equivalent was there as well. And I was hearing for the first time how concerned companies are now about the ever-changing thresholds, the ever-changing barriers, the ever-changing expectations around reporting. And it's maybe time, and that's what we discussed, to also recap and to focus really not only from a reporting standpoint, but also from a requirement standpoint on materiality. And that is obviously financial materiality, dynamic materiality, double materiality. There are multiple materiality contexts out there now, but it's more about what is very much also material to maybe the end consumer on the one hand, and retail investors are very much in that group of also end consumers here, but also ultimately, if you just broadly look at the issue and investor community, taking us as investors, looking at what is the type of information we need to adhere to reporting and reporting requirements. And that's when I come to my last point. There's also still a lot of confusion on the investor side. We have multiple normative frameworks, the ones that exist also for reporting requirements at the company level. You highlighted SASB. SASB now has merged with the IRC to the Value Reporting Foundation. We had a fantastic discussion, by the way. Janine Guillot was on this session with the European Commission as well, getting the inputs on how she is driving the corporate dialogue forward. So we have a lot of expectations on the normative side. We have also expectations when and where labels are concerned. Again, I would call them not regulatory, ultimately normative developments. And they are increasing. You know, ultimately, every jurisdiction in Europe has now its own label. And you would be surprised of how much, especially retail investors, are basing their decisions around ratings, fund ratings, and fund labels. So that's a prerequisite as an investor to ultimately adhere to at least the major ones until the one so-called eco label at an EU level will finally arrive. But then, of course, we have the regulatory requirements, you know, and ultimately SFDR, which are highlighted, is a fantastic ambition and a real vision to really reorient these investments and capital flows towards, you know, more sustainable technologies and businesses, you know, to support growth in a sustainable manner and to contribute to what they say, the creation of a low carbon, climate resilient and circular economy. I would even call it, now that the social taxonomy is currently out for consultation, I would even call it a social economy at large. But it still remains to be seen if we can adhere to all these different levels of reporting requirements, given that data conundrums, divergencies, inconsistencies, and ultimately gaps remain. And this is something, you know, it's a very ambitious project. It cannot be resolved, and Rome wasn't built in one day, but very much appreciated to see that ultimately timelines have been slightly moved, because before even the latest corporate sustainability reporting directive has been launched and confirmed, it will become very tricky then for investors to adhere to, you know, the new reporting requirements, and also to take into account aspects that are now coming out of the EU taxonomy, where green is concerned, before even the social taxonomy has been fully launched. So there's sort of a lot of moving parts, a lot of, you know, requirements which are highlighted on both sides. And I think it's really time now to step back and focus on what's material. And I think this ultimately will guarantee success for commitments, actions, and outcomes from both issuers and investors for the long term.
Thank you so much, Martina. That really makes, you know, so much sense to me now, because I've been hearing about a lot of confusions in this. I would say this is a word for me also. So there's a lot of confusion going on. People are confused about what's green, what's sustainable. So we saw in the news a few days back that European, I think, asset managers in investments, they declined by $2 trillion just because of the definitions, right? So there is a lot of confusion. And I was reading an article on the confusion between carbon offsetting and carbon removal. Now people, you know, they're getting confused with definitions and everything else. And as you're right, I totally agree with you about the materiality focus as well. When, you know, asset managers or investors themselves, you know, if they are put through this mandatory reporting, and then they get their data from the corporates, and the corporates themselves are not very sure about their materiality or the standards that they're adopting. So yes, I can totally understand. We are in a situation, I think, in a flux right now, but definitely we will move in the right direction, and it will take efforts from all of us. My question to you, Jessica, about the greenwashing in the customer space. So we have seen, you know, ads for Fiji water, and the oldest ad, I think very old ads, was of Chevron and Coca-Cola and many more companies who claim that they are green and they are sustainable. In the evening today, I was looking at the beer bottle, and the beer bottle is green, and it mentioned that we are green, you know. Of course the color was green. How do consumers find out more sustainability? How do consumers find out about sustainability of the companies, and how can they assess whether the product itself is really sustainable?
So, I mean, just adding on to what Martina's incredibly comprehensive response, I do think this sort of lack of standard common definition and quality of data, it's an ongoing challenge. And being the optimist, I want to flag that I think we have made a lot of progress with the regulatory developments, better disclosure. So I do think, you know, there's a lot of problems we still need to overcome, but that should not stop us doing this. And I think we have to keep that end goal in mind. You know, the sort of cynicism that we sometimes hear from people who just don't want to be in ESG or even really think it through. I think we need to keep pushing back on that. From sort of retail consumer level, I mean, greenwashing is incredibly concerning, right? Because, you know, when you've got people sort of busily trying to engage retail investors with sustainable investing, and you have this sort of bombardment of marketing and PR, you know, it's going to take one or two stories that essentially will derail things, right? I often tell the personal story of when I was in Hong Kong and I had my mandatory pension fund. So I sort of dutifully, ticked the green fund box. And then about 2 years later, I was like, okay, I'm going to look into what is actually in this fund. And one of the biggest holdings was a large US investment bank. Now, the reason it qualified for the green fund was because its physical carbon footprint is small, right? Because it's not in manufacturing or whatever. However, that investment bank is the largest financier of coal development in Southeast Asia. So, and that's me being an expert in this field and then taking 2 years to realize, actually, that's not where I want to invest my money. So I think I'm a big proponent of a lot of the work of the NGOs, things like BankTrack, and really keeping abreast of what's going on, but also ensuring that banks and financial advisors really understand these products as well. And in my book, what I try to do, and a lot through Moxie, is really engage and arm the investor with the right kind of questions to go and ask, and actually say, look, what does this fund hold? Is this aligned with my priorities? I'm also a really big proponent of the Sustainable Development Goals, because I do feel that, and it's to the point we've already made, right? Sustainability is not just climate, but the Sustainable Development Goals really give us a sort of like the closest thing we have to a global strategy. So, if you think about from an investor perspective, what is the world going to look like by 2030? Your hope is the Sustainable Development Goals are they're shaping the future of our world. Needless to say, we're obviously not on track at the moment, and COVID has taken us off track in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. But they, to me, give a very good framework as an investor, both at the retail and institutional level, in terms of what we're trying to move capital towards. And under each of those 17 goals, there's obviously hundreds of KPIs and targets. And so I think that provides a very comprehensive framework for us to really try and ensure that the greenwashing or even the SDG washing doesn't happen, because we have the data now, we have this framework, these KPIs, and so we just need to leverage. The other, just one final point I wanted to touch on in terms of ESG data, and just following on from what Martina was saying, the one area we look at a lot is gender. And obviously we've moved forward in terms of gender lens investing. There are a lot of gender funds now. But I think this is a really good example of where we find challenges, because we're not just looking at women on boards, right? It cannot be the only criteria if we want to be a gender lens investor. And I think these are the kind of conversations we need to get much more sophisticated about, because a gender fund that only looks at, 30% of women on boards is just missing the point completely. And so the gender thing, I think, is a really good case study for how we need to think a lot more deeply about data, and then how we translate it into these products to ensure that we're not convincing consumers and retail investors that they're investing in something that they're not actually investing in. So that was just the final point I wanted to make about gender.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. I totally agree with you. And, when in our research, we looked at SDG goals. So I think there are about 169 targets overall, if I'm not mistaken. Then all of these, our interns, they could categorize them into ESG. So normally I've seen people getting confused with SDG and ESG when they write. So they just get confused. I'm talking about people who are like new to this field, but then yes, when we did the research, we found out that all of these goals can be categorized as E, S, and G. And companies, if depending on the industry in which they are, they can, focus on these goals. So simultaneously, when we are talking about ESG and the different frameworks like GRI, SASB, whatever, they all can be aligned with SDGs. So very good framework, which if a lot of
Can
sustainable.
I can I
Yes.
just add to that point? And I do wonder, actually, I'd be interested, Martina, your view on this. I think, in a way, ESG is kind of going to become kind of dated because the sustainable development goals are the future of what we're looking for. And, we say it all the time, any company that's well governed will be, managing these E&S risks. And so I do wonder, if we were to have this conversation in 5 years' time, will we be talking about ESG? You know what if you say what were we talking about 5 years ago, people saying, oh, non-financial risks. So that was sort of the extent of the conversation. So we're really moving very, very quickly. And I do wonder if the SDGs are that sort of inherent framework of the future.
Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah, I agree with that. Okay, so now let's move to the frameworks. Yeah, so we have discussed about the different frameworks the companies adopt, GRI, TCFD, and so on. But we still see that there are issues in terms of the data that we get. The transparency and accountability are the two main issues that we see. So, Martina, could you suggest us some ways on how to incentivize companies to not to participate in greenwashing or encouraging them to report their ESG performance transparently?
Yeah, maybe one suggestion would be where we just finished our last note, to look for frameworks that could be utilized for both parties in a material way and fashion/manner, such as the SDG frameworks and underlying targets, as we highlighted, or the goals and targets, I should say, such as the TCFD framework, which is in turn in some jurisdictions also becoming now a mandatory requirement, like in the UK, and New Zealand and Canada have similar ambitions and probably much broader than this. And to ultimately look for, and this is the interesting challenge here, to look also for the discussion to be extended and expanded towards accounting. And I think that's a very interesting development now, what we're seeing at the IFRS end, how and where and when this will not collide, but potentially also create maybe divergencies with frameworks that are already in this space, like SASB, which is by remit a Sustainability Standards Accounting Board, and their efforts have always been more accounting or have been very much accounting centric. So as A4S, not as a framework, but as an initiative that's also engaging with CFOs. And by the way, the UN SDG CFO task force, I was part of it at Moody's. I had just discussions again with them this morning. They're trying to work also more with the investor community. These are very relevant frameworks that highlight that there is need for alignment around specific frameworks that are much broader than what we see now increasingly here in Europe, the so-called taxonomies. And maybe that brings me back to one point which we shouldn't overlook, and that could help also in clarifying some of the conundrums. We have really moved the needle very fast and quickly, as Jessica's mentioned, again, around definitions, around frameworks, around ultimately ambitions and potentially and definitely outcomes. And we've seen that in assets and obviously fund flows, even though some of them, again, have decreased since we are now going and honing down more on definitions, as you had highlighted. But ultimately, what this means now is if we look at SDG frameworks, if we look at TCFD frameworks, the ones that are more based on overarching goals and targets and more linked maybe still to principles, but with the opportunity to derive rules-based approaches, we probably have a good means versus to be either too loose. And that's, again, the paradigm shift I'm trying to highlight here. Historically, we had a lot of principles-based approaches, 6 principles for responsible investment, principles for green bonds, you name it. They actually helped in shaping and growing this market. But now we've come to a point, which is almost an inflection point, where we think, in order to create harmonization, we need more rules-based approaches. And hence we are seeing these type of alignments around frameworks and taxonomies. But at the same time, we are seeing conundrums because more and more there is a regional divide and split, and again, a potential for divergence if we're going down that route of creating too many separate, fragmented, isolated taxonomies. And that is a real risk. So ultimately, using, again, to my first point, using higher level frameworks potentially initially linked to principles, to goals, to targets, versus only and solely too many taxonomies is the way that could help us in really still continuing to grow this market, incentivizing investors and issuers to align without losing them through barriers and thresholds and restrictions. But in the same time, and this is what people also shouldn't forget, in the same time, it will enable us to speak a common language and build a rules-based approach that we need, especially if we want to then build and shape and develop products beyond the reporting and disclosure side, which is of course as relevant. But in order to really move the trillions, we need the solutions, we need the products for all type of investor groups. And if we are too restrictive, we will lose them on the way.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Very good points there. And we do need separate models, separate tools and platforms for different types of investors, the frameworks. Jessica, how does your company align a client's ethical values with the company to invest in? Is there a specific method, process, or framework that you adopt? When I say ethical values, like when you talk about retail investors and individual investors, I am not a full CFA, but I did CFA part, like 2 levels of CFA. So in that, we learned how to develop an IPS, right? So portfolio statement. So when you evaluate like the needs of the investor, how do you educate? You talked about awareness and education. So how do you educate the investor about the responsible investment and integrate his ethical values with the companies or the instruments that you choose for investing?
Yeah, I mean, and I just want to add one quick point to what Martina said, because this whole thing about regional differences, as someone who was very involved in Asia, and now I'm sitting in the Middle East, and those are the discussions that are having in the Middle East. It's like, are we leveraging what's happening in the EU versus, and I think this is a really critical time, because we need alignment across regions and asset classes. And I think you're right, principles are great, but we need to take the next step. To your question, Nisha, so I'm going to talk about retail investors specifically, because of my focus that I do with female investors. And I think one thing that I'm very clear about is that you can't fix everything as a retail investor. So you have to prioritize the issues or what you care about. So I talk a lot about, so I'm a very active, as I mentioned, gender before, I'm a very active gender lens investor. I also very focused on climate. So I think it's being able to decide what matters to you as an individual and not thinking you can fix everything because you can't. And then we talk a lot about how we translate those values into investment beliefs. And so it kind of mirrors what you would do at an institutional level. You build your strategy, you focus on what asset classes you want to be in, and you figure out your boundaries. And I think one of the challenges from a retail investor perspective is that, unfortunately, it does take time. Right, it's not that easy because the market still is in its infancy, and because of the risk of there is a lot of greenwashing going on. I think as individuals we need to do the legwork to be able to make much more conscious investment decisions, and then monitor how we do over time. One of my key messages in the work that I do is around women being empowered and educated, because I think that's the first step. There's a lot of data out there that talks about women, and this is a global phenomenon, right? Women who feel disengaged from the financial and investment industry. They may feel patronized by financial advisors. And so they're not necessarily going out and asking the right questions. And so what we've seen now is a lot of platforms coming up, really trying to engage and improve the financial literacy of women. And then the work that I do is actually say, well, actually, it's not just about investing more, it's actually investing more consciously, and in sort of sustainable investment funds, ETFs, and so on. So I think really just being able to identify what matters to you, build it into your beliefs, and then actually have those conversations with your financial institution is the critical next step. And I do also like to flag that the more and more we demand these products, the more and more they'll come onto the market. And I think, that whole thing about COVID, I don't know, Martina, if you felt the same way. When COVID hit at the beginning of 2020, I was genuinely concerned that it was going to be a real it was going to make sustainable investing even harder, because obviously governments and regulators and institutional investors become very short-term in focus. But actually here we sit in 2021, and the good thing that's come out of COVID is the demand is still there. And I think partly because people actually now realize the sort of interconnectedness of these global events, but also the inequality that sits across, we've all endured COVID in very different ways. And so from the investor perspective, I think that's actually been incredibly powerful. Also, the fact that these sustainability companies, the ones that the sustainability leaders have done better, right? Because they're more resilient. So, in 2020 at the beginning, I was really worried, but actually where we sit now, 2021, it's been sort of a positive influence and impact on the sustainable investment trajectory overall, actually.
Thank you so much, Jessica. To add on, or I want to actually have an extended question for you on this. What role do women play in sustainable investing and creating sustainable future? I'm not talking only about the investors, I'm talking about us. What role are we playing also, along with the investors, of course?
Yeah.
What do you think?
So this is my big passion, right? This is my hobby, not my day job. Okay, so there's just two really, so there's obvious trends happening, right? Women are owning more and more private wealth. We're now at about 32%, and it's looking like it's going to double every decade, right? So we're controlling, we're influencing, we're moving capital now. But the second thing is this whole thing around motivation to be sustainable investors. I've done a lot of research, Moxie's done a lot of research, and just a couple of data points we've got. So we surveyed women all across the world, and we found that 83% of women surveyed care about where their money is invested. 69% feel a sense of urgency to invest responsibly. So what we have is this women owning more wealth, women really caring about impact and sustainability. And now what do we do then to really support them in really engaging on sustainable investing? And that's very much the sort of the work that I've been doing both through Moxie and my recent book that I published. The whole idea is that money is a lever of change, right? We have different ways to influence what we want to see in the world, and capital money is a critical one of those. And so the more we have that conversation with women, I think is obviously a very powerful thing. So when I talk about financial feminism, it's not just about the empowerment of women. It's actually saying what we want is to support women in aligning their investment and consumer choices with their value frameworks. And we shouldn't shy away from that. For too long we have, all three of us work in a very male-dominated industry still, right? And so that's what I think things are really changing. I think the more and more women come to the table in terms of what they want to do with their money, however that is, whether it's investing, spending, or whatever, the more change we're going to see happening. So I think that's one of the most exciting trends coming out of 2021.
Thank you so much. Way to go. We'll do it. Let me take some questions from the audience. So we have a few questions here. Our key concern, how accurate and reliable is the ESG data for corporation to be assessed and aligned with investors' evaluation? So Daniel is asking this question. How accurate and reliable is the data when you're assessing and aligning with investors' evaluation? Either of you can take this question.
Martina, you can have that one.
Sure. Very good question. I mean, the assessment at the end of the day is only as accurate as the process and the underlying data is in turn. That would be my short answer. But that obviously is also very much a vague and open answer. I'm quite clear about this. I think what we still have in our sphere, but even in other areas, when and where extra financial information generally and sustainability information is just one part of this wider spectrum, is concerned. So ultimately, again, through collaborative efforts, and they very much are collaborative across the investment value chain, working also with policy and regulation, and ultimately maybe even consumers and other NGO groups, etc., to very much mandate for more transparency and clarity on the one hand, definitions on the other, ultimately to align when and where frameworks and standards are concerned, as we highlighted, And then ultimately to also define the type of areas from an investor side that we would like to focus on. And Jessica made that very important comment, not every size fits all, and it shouldn't. And that's why not even every data set fits all. And sometimes when we're also talking about divergence, we have to be very precise on what we mean by divergence, on ESG or related to ESG information. We have scope, we have weightings, we have measurements divergencies, but clearly there are also specific data sets by remit that are non-comparable because they focus, on a very small part of the equation, but maybe are very specialist data sets that we need to assess maybe biodiversity risk. I'm just highlighting iceberg here, just capital for human capital related implications, and so on and so on. So not one size fits all, and it shouldn't. It's more about ensuring that the fundamentals are in place and that we are talking around the same type of definitions and the same type of frameworks, ideally, that we use to then align our processes and ultimately the outcomes.
Thank you so much, Martina. I think one question is for Jessica. Does Sharia-based investment, example, Sukuk, align with ESG investment?
I wasn't expecting an Islamic finance question. I do a lot of work. I'm in a ministry on various organizations, and yes, absolutely. And there's a lot of conversations happening around that alignment. I think, though, obviously on the Sharia basis, it's a negative screening, right? Whereas actually ESG investing is much more, much more than that. So I'm not dismissive of it, but those conversations are happening, and I think they're very important. But I think there's still quite a lot of work to do. Certainly here in the Middle East, it's been interesting actually, like on the Sukuk side, to see what's been coming out and the motivation and how it is aligned with the ESG conversation as well. But they're still very small scale. So I think, we're going to see what's going to happen over the next couple of years. But I have to say, I'm not a Sharia expert. So.
Thank you so much, Jessica. There's one question from a woman. I'm not sure whether she's a girl or woman, but yes, she has 10 years experience. And she wants to know how she can pursue a career in sustainability. So I would like to know more. Her name is Neha. Neha, I would like to know more what you are doing currently and how would you build your career. But if you have any thoughts, Martina or Jessica, you can answer to that, how she can enter into sustainability field and in what ways. Yeah.
Martina, can I just say one thing? Because
yeah, absolutely. Yes, please.
You and I have been in this space for a long time, right? And it has been a hard struggle, right? Knocking on doors, trying to convince people around materiality. And it's been so refreshing the last couple of years that now we're having these mainstream discussions. So I think for young people who want to move into sustainability, sustainable finance, it's the time to do it, right? It's the future of finance. And just be grateful that it's not what it was 15, 20 years ago.
She's working in indices generation.
Very much the fundamentals are there. Just let me add to this. Absolutely. Jessica and myself, we have seen this really from the grassroots movement to the mainstream ultimately. And what is so exciting now is that our field is literally still ever evolving. And that means the experts, even we are specialists, if you look at our CVs, at our backgrounds, at our skill sets, they're very much and very often very diverse too. They very much reflect the universalism and the complexity that we try to address and cover. So I've initially got a legal background, then moved into financial services, early with this focus on ESG and SRI, but in all honesty, because no one wanted to be in this field. And I found it interesting, challenging. I always was looking for something that was around innovation and to improve the situation. For not only individuals, but ultimately collectives, communities at large, and to combine this with the elements of education. Hence, my different steps on the NGO side with a network for sustainable financial markets. And by the way, that's also a good way in following different think tanks, next gen think tanks, female think tanks, such as Jessica's, that actually inspire and support and educate when and where and how you can make your move. And then ultimately to work in academia, to support, same as you, Nisha, to support the developments, to reflect, and Jessica has done the same with a strong gender lens, to reflect on the developments and how we can actually, again, innovate and then ultimately integrate and implement into decision making. And I think, therefore, this is really the age of the universalist. This is the area for the universalist. And therefore, there are absolutely no limitations. But especially if you bring a strong financial services or human rights related or labor rights related, legal and increasingly compliance background to some of these topics, again, because ESG is ever evolving on the investor side, on the issuer side, on the regulatory side, the opportunities are so varifold, and that makes our space, which is no longer a space, it is actually a mainstream development, but it makes it so diverse and it makes it so full of opportunities. And that is definitely something that I've encountered, and so did Jessica, over the last 20 years of our careers here.
Thank you so much. In fact, Martina, when I did my PhD, I did OECD, evaluation for companies in India and some companies in China. And then what I found was the sixth variable, that was OECD sixth variable in corporate governance, is value creation for stakeholders. That time, people were referring that to as equal to CSR. And I was attending actually side-by-side conferences related to corporate governance and CSR, and I was wondering which area should I go to? And then,
Exactly.
which area should I pursue? But now when we see it in today's world, they are overlapping. Everything is overlapping. And then that's why I got interested, and I'm pursuing this passion also in the ESG area, taking that thing forward. So yes, you're right that, if you are in this area, then try to look for venues, and it's a very universal area. You can pursue.
Exactly. And connect with all of us here, and through networks, right? And through education initiatives. And I have these interchanges through the network as well, quite frequently, and also supporting, educating the next generation. And I've helped in the past, and I'm very proud of that, supporting the career path of people, like Professor Theodore Coggiano, who is now on the EU Sustainable Finance Action Platform, and others involved in the EFRA group, that really have planted the seeds. These were my former interns, if I may, but I enjoyed that interchange, regardless of how old they were, how old I was then and there. But ultimately, it's all about connecting, the interconnectedness of ESG and relationships. And that's something that's also very much strong to our space. And that remains, the space, even though it's becoming this mainstream, or has become this mainstream movement. But the people also, like Jessica and myself, we remain, and hopefully Nisha, we remain connected. And we always meet again. We are, it's the same shared values approach that is also driving this community. And I think therefore has been so collaboratively successful in what we have seen.
Yeah, definitely.
And there's loads of women in it as well.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the community spirit, right? I think there's even research out there saying inherently men are more, focused on some quantitative approaches. And hence, in ESG, they're more drawn towards for instance, climate related strategies, because you can measure GHG footprint. Let's face it. But women have a more socially led, community led approach by remit. And therefore, a lot of the S topics that are maybe harder to quantify, at least at present, we are drawn to these topics because they open up more qualitative elements and opportunities that maybe a hardcore quant might not be willing to accept and even to understand. So that's an interesting way as well, looking at the whole spectrum of ESG, also with a different type of gender lenses. But then, of course, we shouldn't forget there's also an age lens here. I think the next generation generally, right, is drawn to these topics much more, because we all are still part of that generation that will be severely, look at the heat today here, impacted by the implications related to climate change, COVID, societal polarization, you name and shame it. I think there's a lot to be said for this.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you so much. I'll take rest of the questions in a few minutes. I have a last question for you from my side, Martina, and then we'll take more audience questions. It's about portfolio returns. So I would like to know your opinion about, how do you balance portfolio returns and while integrating ESG? more so if I say, let's say, impact investments or those kind of funds, So how do you balance the portfolio returns there?
Very good question. I think historically there was a bit of a misconception and that was also reflected in the way fiduciary duty, for instance, was looked at also by some of the regulators in that space. And in the US, it's still a big debate, right? If and when and where ESG would mean you're mitigating your risk return opportunities or you're downgrading the results. Ultimately, many studies in academia have proven that at least for the medium to longer term, ESG strategies, say, let's take simply equities, tend to outperform, at least positively perform, in some instances also to outperform. And now that we are more and more moving into the sphere of factor-related investing, and by the way, I should mention I'm working on the next book, which is ESG in Portfolio Construction, and we would be discussing fundamental, thematic, and factor-related approaches for active and passive investing, also the trade-offs of these. We are trying actually to set the record straight and to showcase, depending, of course, on which decisions you take for your strategy related to exclusions. Are you restricting and limiting your universe, right? Maybe far too early. And this is always necessary. And is it creating the right outcomes and impacts that we need? Question mark. In regards to integration, and of course, and we shouldn't forget active ownership and what can be actually achieved through an approach that includes engagement and of course voting. And the time horizons concerned, we're actually looking for these different type of approaches. This will be something I think which will hopefully clarify a lot of these misconceptions. And again, in turn, and in all fairness, in academia in particular, a lot of these misconceptions have been overcome. And there are multiple studies out there from Harvard, from Oxford University, University of Hamburg, Zurich, just to highlight a few, that actually say generally it's saying that we provide a protection against certain risks, so downside protection, given naturally we're looking at risk mitigation strategies, but also sometimes even prevention strategies. But likewise, there's also a lot of growth and opportunity in here. And depending on, again, which route you're taking, let's take a fundamental strategy and or a thematic strategy, you absolutely can also achieve positive performance over shorter time periods. It is very much depending on the approach and the type of parameters you're setting very early on in the process. And the same applies, but even more so ex ante when and where criteria are concerned, of course, impact investment strategies too.
Great, thank you so much. Next question I would like to take from Michela. She's in the, actually, I'm also representing here Women Entrepreneurship Days Forum organization. And Michela is our ambassador from Indonesia. So she's from fishing business family, and she's been working in that business for many years. But she's struggling to implement ESG into her traditional fishing and manufacturing operations. So any advice on how to be successful to pioneer in the blue economy from a tuna town? That's what she's asking. So if you've come across any kind of such companies, how did you evaluate ESG? And maybe that, that kind of evaluation would be helpful for her.
There's an interesting Verisk Maplecroft, now they're part of Maplecroft, report on human rights controversies in the seafood supply chain. And that was a big topic for investors. Viva, myself, then and there, more on the investors, on the service provider side, and various others have done some work around this. And again, a fantastic report that was issued particularly on these challenges and how they're being assessed by investors and how some of the seafood supply chain providers, so to say, try to tackle the overcoming conundrums, plus obviously the large-scale supermarkets that at the end of the day had to provide more information on traceability and sourcing. They all worked in this collaboratively to provide certain outcomes. And some of this research is well reflected in this dedicated report. But just as one source, I'm sure there are many other references.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Maybe if you can share with us the name of the report, I'll pass it on to her. Yeah, I will take one last question from the audience. Some people are skeptical about ESG, and this is a way to create further inequality between developed and underdeveloped countries. So how can we build more alignment so that countries don't see ESG as imposition of a hidden tax or underdeveloped countries? So yeah, in underdeveloped countries, when we talk about sustainability, they don't want, because especially after COVID situation. So where is the balance? How do we bring the alignment there?
Can I just, one thing I want
Jessica, please, yeah.
to say to that, I mean, this comes back to the question about risk and business opportunity, right? So ESG is not a hidden tax. It's a way to manage the risks that we are very visibly seeing playing out today, right? Martina mentioned the hot weather. We've seen the floods in Germany. We've seen, this is happening today, right? So when we talk about inequality between countries, we also know that the ravages of climate change are going to impact lower income countries, lower income parts of society, right? It affects everything. It affects migration, food security. And so I think we just need to move the dialogue from about it being this sort of hidden burden, and actually it's about how we design financial systems and capital markets that fully reflect the social and environmental cost of what we're doing. And that's the crux of what we haven't got right. That's why we're in this situation, because we haven't been pricing in all of these other risks that we now face very visibly today. So I think, and climate change is the obvious next big pandemic waiting to happen in a way, right? And so my sort of encouragement is not to get trapped in that dialogue on it means it's more costly, it's more burdensome. Actually, it's about how we build a future. And again, back to the Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals are trying to address these inequalities.
Yeah.
Very much so. Maybe as a last reference point here, and this brings us exactly back to the Sustainable Development Goals and how the framework can be utilized also for decision making, right? We are founding members, and I've been pushing this topic for some time, of the Just Transition. And the Just Transition Coalition is trying exactly to do this. There are certain trade-offs when you go into discussions around how you are transitioning towards a green economy. And these trade-offs very often include, social aspects, reskilling, upskilling, retraining. Local communities are severely impacted, especially in Eastern Europe. And we shouldn't be shying away from having these discussions, because that's also part of the problem why the so-called woke movement that we all are part of has been criticized and being literally out of touch with reality. But in turn, it's now important to say, we need to therefore offer relevant solutions. We need to identify the problem. We need to name and shame it. And we need to identify solutions that are looking, across the spectrum. Again, the interconnectedness of issues and understanding them. And then ultimately offering solutions and ideally products to tackle them. There are means when and where the sovereign level, with the Just Transition Mechanism, a specific fund that has been set up by the EU, for instance, to provide means for upskilling, reskilling, retraining in these regions for local communities, is actually one means. And again, I think side by side, and this is what this investor coalition is now trying to do, we try to work with companies, entities involved in these regions, for instance. We're trying, and obviously involved utility companies involved and impacted by the transition, to actually trying to work out jointly how they can support the initiatives in local communities and therefore create joint benefits, co-benefits that will ultimately also address some of the problems. But maybe it's also exactly as Jessica said, we shouldn't just only looking at this with a risk lens only. It's very much the opportunities lens. It's creating positive change trajectories for the climate, for the ecological, and what I just highlighted, for the just transition. And this is again where we see, you highlighted this earlier, and I think Jessica mentioned it as well. Where do we go with this? We have now mainstreamed ESG. Now we have assessed the risks at large. We are now at a point in time where we also need to really work on product solutions, opportunities, and they must absolutely include the sovereigns. We should actually have the same type of engagements, the same type of scrutiny that we are putting at assessing companies when we increasing our literally engagement work with sovereigns on addressing some of these issues that are very much, global issues that are driven by and spearheaded, accelerated by globalization. And again, I think investors, issuers, and others have a significant role to play in also educating the broader system and systems that are part of our society and environment, and ultimately part of what we're aiming to achieve over the long term. I'm stopping here.
Yeah, thank you so much. You summarized it all, Martina. Yeah, let me just quickly go over to the points that we discussed today. Uh, so we talked about that we mostly investors use third-party ratings, and there is a data challenge right now because a lot of principles-based, mechanisms are now moving towards rules-based, which is creating a lot of confusion for the investors. But this will settle down, I think, sooner. And then there is another challenge for the coverage of SMEs. The regulations are increasing and SMEs are finding it difficult to report. And of course, there's problem of alignment of frameworks. And, we are seeing new developments. Alignments is a new development. Also, like IIRC aligned with SASP, they merged. And now IFRS is coming up with the new guidelines very soon. So we'll see alignment there. And matters to individual investors are equally important. So we have challenges for the retail investors, and it's very much in infancy, as Jessica mentioned. So these are some of the challenges that we are facing. And of course, I also noted that stakeholder engagement is needed because of the materiality issues that the companies are facing and even the asset managers are facing. So we need that. And then there are challenges of regional differences. The East and the West, and the developed and the underdeveloped markets. And then we also talked about women are earning more wealth and they can actively participate and help in terms of awareness, education, and whatever role they can take, and they can do a lot of, they can help in sustainable development. So these are some of the points that we took from today's webinar. Towards the end, like some of the challenges that we discussed here, actually we have built a platform to address some of those. So would like to share with you, if you don't mind, 5 minutes I'll take to talk about what we have done in these areas. So just sharing my screen here. So our platform is called Corp Stage, and what we have done is we have created it like a value creation marketplace, which brings companies, investors, and communities together to build a sustainable future. Like one of the Neha was asking here about how to participate in sustainability, and we said that getting engaged with the community and then see where you can contribute. So this is the platform where we engage with the communities as well, but companies will be able to manage their sustainability initiatives and report in global industry formats. So we are seeing that a lot of alignment is happening in this area, like all the frameworks are aligning. Our platform caters to all those frameworks, but as I said, that we have done a research and we have mapped them very well. So one SASB, let's say, dimension is mapped to TCFD, CDP, everything, GRI and SDGs as well. And then what we have done is, along with that mapping, we have mapped it to business KPIs also, as we are saying that there are not only risks, but there are opportunities as well. So this platform will actually force the companies to think about, okay, you're tackling this particular area of, let's say you want to report on GRI, but you want to tackle this environmental aspect. Don't just think about that. There is an opportunity there. So you'll make money, you'll make value there as well. So then we are also engaging with the investors compare the progress made by various companies and incentivize the value creation. Then there are communities which contribute to the initiatives, the goals achieved, and there are tokens earned. We are using Industry 4.0 technologies here. And then companies can earn trust and tokens by showcasing their progress initiatives. So our vision is that governments, as we said, as Martina mentioned, that sovereigns need to also work towards sustainable value creation. So governments can move in that direction. Companies will feel trusted and valued by the investors. and then there will be no dirty money in the market. So there will be a lot of clean money and going to the sustainable development. So the aim, the mission is to promote ethical, sustainable value creation for communities and corporates by using the technologies. And so our platform has got 3 screens, mainly one for the community, the other one for the companies to manage the sustainable development, and then for the investors to compare the performance of the company. So all these things we are doing as a part of COP stage. And then one of the key challenges is about the SMEs. That also will be handled on COP stage, because if you look at the ESG framework and the reporting frameworks, they are mostly for the listed companies. And then if they are for the listed companies, it's very elaborate and it can be time consuming and costly for the companies to report on those. And they don't understand. So the awareness is also not there. But then if we are providing a simple platform where they can track their whatever they commit, like sustainable value strategies. So they'll be able to track the strategies, the achievement, and then convert them into tokens and get incentivized. So this is what we are thinking as in the COP stage. Very soon we'll be out with this platform, and it will cater to mid-size and small-scale companies first, and then we'll move towards the large companies. Yeah. Thank you so much for listening and for your participation today. Very, very grateful, truly appreciated. Thank you from COP Stage, Nishwin, and VIDO, Women in Entrepreneurship Days organization as well. And I look forward to keep in touch with you, keep collaborating, and keep discussing more on these areas. And let's see where we can contribute to this world. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Martina. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, dear audience. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.